The diplomatic relationship between the United States and South Africa is at an all-time low. How did we get here, and what are the prospects for the future of this important relationship, and what does it mean for politics here domestically in South Africa? My name is David Ansara with the Free Market Foundation, and I'm joined by my former colleague, Terence Corrigan, at the Institute of Race Relations. Terence, welcome to the Free Market Foundation.
Always a pleasure to be here, David.
And you are something of a fundi when it comes to international affairs. You've lived abroad in Taiwan for many years, but you've also immersed yourself in understanding the history of this diplomatic relationship between South Africa and the United States. So I think you're the perfect person to,
thank you very much,
to speak to us today. So maybe take us back in time. What is the historical connection between these two countries?
Well, it started in 1799. The first American consulate established in Cape Town, and the reason for that was that American whalers used to harvest off the in the Southern Ocean. So, of course, when they came ashore, sailors are not known for their discretion, and often you needed a consul to come and bail you out. Obviously, these countries are on different ends of the world, and travel not being quite as accessible. But over the years, there was trade in wool. There were contacts between the United States, obviously, and Great Britain, and South Africa or parts of South Africa being part of the British Empire, but also treaties made with the Free State, the Free State Republic. During the Boer War, large numbers of American horses and mules were purchased by the British Army, and Americans served in both the Boer Commandos and the British forces. American miners during the gold rush came here in large numbers. Remember, many of them were veterans of the California gold rush or had mined coal in Pennsylvania, and much of the early mining technology actually originated in the United States. In the First and Second World Wars, the United States and South Africa were allied at various points. South African troops in Italy fought under American command at times, and were given a ringing endorsement by General Mark Clark. South Africa was a founding member of the League of Nations, which America wasn't really involved, but then the United Nations. And in those early years, post World War II, South Africa and America were very much part of the same, call it, Western coalition. Now, this coincided with decolonization. America in 1945 had 50% of the world's GDP. It was the undisputed hegemon, but the world was shifting. And many of its allies were colonial powers, and you had countries like India in 1947, and later other countries in Asia, then Africa breaking away. And South Africa became a sort of flashpoint. It embodied, in many respects, was symbolic of the worst of the colonial experience. Not only was it independent of its former colonial master, but it replicated many of those and even expanded on some of those practices. So 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a mixture of kind of cooperation and tension. America recognized South Africa as being part of that broad coalition, although at arm's length, a bit like, let's say, Cuba prior to the revolution, or Nicaragua prior to the Sandinistas. Keep your distance, and bit by bit, it started to cut off some of those connections, particularly arms. But South Africa was also regarded as being central to Western security because of the Cape Sea route, and because it was what was called the Persian Gulf of Minerals. There are congressional studies from the 1980s that show the limits of sanctions simply because it could hurt America more than it could hurt South Africa. South Africa's foreign exchange was not earned primarily through the strategic minerals, but through gold. So you could perhaps cut the gold off, but you could not cut off the platinum or the various other valuables. So this was a very difficult relationship. It was also seen in America almost as an extension of the American civil rights struggle. So of course, when the time for a transition came around, this was also when the Cold War had ended. America was the only game in town, and it was very keen on a stable transition that would produce a sort of Western-oriented democracy, perhaps not entirely pro-Western, but more or less in the club. So a lot of effort, diplomatic and financial, was put into making that transition happen. That takes us to 1994. And what we are seeing now is, let's say, the kind of end point of the relationship that has followed since.
Obviously, the Cold War context, the United States was keen to push back the wave of communism that was sweeping the world in Southeast Asia, for example, the Marxist-Leninist movements in Mozambique, Angola. That was a key strategic interest for the Americans, and that's why they sort of had this kind of dual relationship with South Africa. In one sense, there was pressure being brought against the apartheid regime, but the National Party was seen as a kind of bulwark against communism. Right.
Well, look, there was the South Africa's first intervention, if I can use a neutral term, in Angola in the mid-70s. That was tacitly supported by America, but that became, in a sense, a potato too hot for them to handle, so they pulled away, leaving South Africa dangerously exposed. And that was that left a very, very deep imprint on the mind of what I'd broadly call Africana nationalism, which is why you also see amongst many of South Africa's sort of white right a very ambivalent relationship to America, if not outright hostility. But yes, the idea of South Africa going communist or going into the Soviet camp was one that simply they didn't want to countenance. The African National Congress, must be remembered, was very much in that Soviet camp, and this is not Roy Gafar rhetoric. You can go and read their documents. Reading the January the 8th statements in the 1980s, there's no question, who the good guys and the bad guys are, and it's not just America, although that was seen very much as the avatar of imperialism. The ANC's National Democratic Revolution, you read the documents on that, is very much about how South African society can navigate this imperial-dominated world and ultimately break out of it. During the Cold War, the idea was that the Soviet Union would provide an alternative pole. By the 1990s, that no longer existed for the moment, although in the interim, China has sort of stepped in within the ANC's worldview into that. But yes, it did. It left the ANC with a particular view of America, and not a positive one. And as I say, that is very much what we've now walked into with the logical consequences.
And of course, from the 1960s, the ANC in exile was warmly embraced by the Soviet Union, provision of arms for MK, intelligence collaboration. And Jacob Zuma speaks Russian for a reason, because he spent a lot of time
so does Thabo Mbeki.
Yeah.
Look, in a way, one should not condemn the ANC too harshly. They took the sport where they could find it. But there's no gainsaying the fact that that left a mark. Someone reading ANC documents today about geopolitics can go back and read stuff that was being produced in East Berlin in the 1970s, and there's an absolute continuity. This idea that there is this sort of this movement for peace, which is kind of a generic socialist phrase that is often involved, and imperialism. Now, imperialism is not to be understood necessarily as rolling your tanks into someone else's real estate. It's about the way Western capitalist countries interact with countries that are not Western capitalists. So in other words, the Iraq adventure is imperialism. The Ukraine adventure is a special military operation. You see the difference.
Yeah, and then obviously the National Democratic Revolution, that idea very much formed in that context of mimicking some of the other anti-colonial movements, like in Vietnam, for example. And I had an excellent conversation with your colleague Anthea Jeffrey about the roots of the NDR and how that's played out in terms of policy. So I'd encourage our audience to go and check that out. We'll put a link in the description. But let's get back to America. So end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama wrote that this was the end of history, the triumph of liberal democracy around the world. And one of the models, the darlings of the global community was the African National Congress led by Nelson Mandela, the triumph of reconciliation, rainbows, and togetherness, and this was kind of seen as a starting point of a new relationship.
Well, I'm very familiar with it, with Fukuyama's argument. I think you need to go about 8 years subsequent to that and look at Fareed Zakaria talking about illiberal democracy, which I think was a very good counterpoint. That while the sort of electoral map was shifting in the world, that countries were electing their governments, these were often not the kind of democracies that had traditionally been understood. And today, virtually all autocracies have now, in a sense, gone condo. And you at least need the legitimation of having an election. Yeah. Zimbabwe has elections, for instance, but we all know who's going to win at the end of the day.
Okay, so the 1990s, what was that relationship like?
Right,
the two countries.
I think that one virtue I can certainly credit the ANC of Mandela's era with is pragmatism. They understood that there was no Soviet patron now, that the economy was effectively bankrupt, and you kind of had to play by the rules as they existed. So in that time, also given Mandela's personal charisma and personal brand, South Africa was a kind of darling. Very warm relations. President Clinton became one of the first American presidents to really prioritize Africa. He used to speak about the African Renaissance, although that remained more a theoretical construct than an actual blueprint for governance. And a lot of this was, of course, being done because he was appealing to a domestic base. South Africa often being, for the Americans, as I think America is for us, almost a place in the heart rather than a place in the mind. But warm relations. Under President Mbeki, they became what I would consider correct. There were many points of tension, the Iraq War, for instance, being a big one, Israel-Palestine being another. Mbeki also aspired to play a much more prominent and, in a sense, confrontational role on the world stage. But there was a sense that South Africa needed that relationship with the United States, and reciprocally on the American side, South Africa.
George W. Bush referred to Mbeki as his point man in Africa.
Point man in Zimbabwe. More than that, a strong, stable democratic South Africa was seen as good for America. This was not the most stable region in the world, and having a functioning democracy with a strong economy, that was good. It was good for business. It was good for trade. It was good for diplomacy. You can at least engage with a stable government. And I think also you had some reasonably good people in the foreign affairs bureaucracy who, whatever their personal ideology, understood this. So Mbeki and Bush could speak as pretty much as equals. And remember, Bush also, I think, had a strain of compassion about him. If you think about the PEPFAR initiative, AIDS, those are things for which he is, I think, quite rightly fondly remembered in Africa. One area of the world where by the end of his term, polling was showing that he was still quite well regarded. His ratings had collapsed everywhere else. Zuma and South Africa's decline. Unfortunately, our foreign affairs were hit by the same things that hit our municipality. Politicization, corruption, just general lack of attention to any detail, the running down of capacity. And this, as I say, if you look at the National Development Plan, they're really raising questions about it. We have this monstrous diplomatic presence, and what are we getting for it?
Yeah, I think South Africa has something like the third largest diplomatic
it sort of depends. Yeah, it sort of depends on how you measure that, if it's embassies or consulates. But yes, it is definitely way above the mean for countries of the size of its economy. South Africa, by that stage, had slipped out of the world's headlines. It became, in many ways, synonymous with corruption, with the fact that the Rainbow Nation had elected a president under the kind of cloud that Zuma was. State capture was a word we gifted, well, I think we gifted to the modern world lexicon. by every metric, South Africa was failing. We never really recovered from the global financial crisis. You look at other developing market peers, they had this bump and they carried on.
A V-shaped recovery,
By the time President Ramaphosa took office, my sense is that you had this, is that we've been going through an utter denouement. First of all, we do not have the capacity. That has all been run down. Secondly, there has been a default to some extreme ideological positions, which often seem completely, there are numerous contradictions. We want investment, we want trade, but we also want to very publicly stick it in America's eye. If you think about the proposal to rename the road on which the American consulate in Johannesburg is, it's just complete insanity. But more than that, it's been remarked by numerous commentators that our embassy in Washington is virtually invisible. There is no pushback to unfavorable coverage. When the Lady R event happened, the ambassador to Washington was on extended sick leave, and there was just no one to go and bat in South Africa's corner. A lack of appreciation of the pragmatic goals in this relationship, I think, have been swallowed by the ideological ones. I think it's almost a kind of default factory setting. Under Mandela and Mbeki, these could, in a sense, be parked or at least deferred. And what I've seen in the last couple of years, that there's just no appetite or even understanding of the need to do so. That the point of diplomacy is not to agree at all times, but to actually manage those disagreements. And I don't see the capacity to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a few anecdotes from one of our former colleagues. I remember coming back from a trip to Washington, just complaining that there was no air conditioning in the embassy when he went to go and visit.
Yes.
And I mean, this is kind of sweltering heat in the middle of summer. Which is a little thing, but it kind of suggests a lack of attention to detail, lack of care, really.
Well, look, this is something that has hit our embassies around the world. There was a report a little while ago about some of our Asian missions not having the equipment to print visas. Now that's really, really basic. My own sense is that what you're dealing with President Trump is, let's say, a new breed of politician, to put it gently. This is not Mitt Romney, this is not John McCain, it's not Bill Clinton, and it's not Obama. I think that there is, in a sense, a real changeover moment there, and perhaps it's temporary, perhaps it lasts. But the point is that a diplomatic corps worthy of its name should have understood this, should have reached out to people in that camp and tried to maintain a sort of continuity of those things that mattered. In the event, I just don't sense that any of this happened. There seems to be no understanding of the power brokers within that movement, no alternative vectors of influence. Think about this, for instance, the case against Israel. Why is it that South Africa has been singled out for special censure? The countries like Ireland, Spain, Norway, Malaysia have all jumped on board. I'll say one thing. Well, first of all, I think South Africa put itself very, very forcefully in the front line. And whatever one may think of the merits of the case, South Africa simply did not have the diplomatic capacity to handle the fallout. But those other countries have all got vectors of influence that they have cultivated very, very carefully. There's a big Irish diaspora in America. There's a lot of tech investment in Ireland, Norway and Spain, both NATO members. The point is that these countries have alternative means of influence, and South Africa seem to have forgone all of what it might have had, neglected to build those new forms of influence, and is now surprised that it's effectively unable to manage this relationship, and the farce of not having an ambassador and having an envoy who couldn't get a visa to go to America. This says to me the sort of confluence between incapacity and ideology. And that's a very dangerous combination to have.
Terence, do you think that the relationship as it stands is being deliberately sabotaged or compromised by the South Africans, that they actually don't value the relationship and want to move away?
I think that this is a problem. That answering that sort of question is a problem that's always existed in South African political science, because what constitutes the South African state? And I think the South African state has often been a very inchoate entity. I suspect that if you speak to people, say officials in the Department of Trade and Industry, you might get a very different, response from what you might get at DIRCO. My sense of it is that this probably owes more to hubris and to an inflated self-image, and to a sense that South Africa is somehow special and will always be excused its transgressions. Or if it won't be, well, it's a sacrifice we're happy for the people of the country to make. There are, look, I can tell you that there are plenty of people within our foreign policy ecosystem that are deeply antagonistic to America, so I don't think they're losing any sleep over it. I would need to see more evidence to suggest that it's been deliberately sabotaged. But I think that, if you've simply observed the course of events and done nothing to try, or done very little and acted very ineffectually to try and alter them, the effect is pretty much the same.
Well, I would argue that not appointing an ambassador, appointing a special liaison who perhaps you would have known that the Americans wouldn't have enjoyed his ties with MTN and allegations that he was affiliated with Iran, that suggests a kind of thumbing of the nose towards the Americans.
I think maybe one needs to distinguish between a thumbing of the nose, which I think is probably almost is a regular occurrence, and believing that there is going to be a consequence for it. And I think this is perhaps something that the South African state has become very kind of comfortable with, the idea that whatever we do, it's not really going to make much of a difference, which is why we can sit with, the kind of anemic growth we have for a generation. And, well, so what?
Yeah, I mean, your point earlier about that Trump has disrupted the normal mechanisms of governance, both domestically and internationally. And maybe the ANC hasn't updated its model sufficiently enough, because if you think of the last 30 years, they've been able to play both sides quite effectively and, rail against American imperialism whilst receiving PEPFAR funding and AGOA trade access.
Look, I think that DIRCO, probably more so than most ministries, is geared towards that ideological track. And as I say, I think that there's an instant default back to the ideological position, which I think speaks something very, very disturbing, which is not always sufficiently understood, and that is that there's a complete lack of maturity and almost seriousness about the way South Africa carries itself. I think there's also been a kind of seductive belief in the potential and power of BRICS, and specifically China, to step in as South Africa's patron. That's just not the case. There are too many elements to get into there, but South Africa's trade with Brazil, for instance, isn't enormous. Trade with China is mostly, case of raw materials out and finished goods in, which pushes against as I say, go to the trade and industry, against the whole industrialization thing. But I gather that there was a time when a previous minister was asked about this, and he simply said, "Well, with China, it's political, so we can't do anything about that." But yes, look, as I say, I believe that there are probably many people within DIRCO, within the ANC, for whom this is, almost an intoxicatingly exciting moment, where they are standing up to the Yankee imperialists like the Vietnamese did in the 1960s. The difference, of course, is that the Vietnamese in the 1960s were an incredibly poor society, and we're operating on a very different lifestyle model. South Africa's population is one that aspires to a middle class status, in a consumer society, and odds are that the way things are being led is going to take us further and further away from that goal.
So into the present moment, we've had this Africana delegation that went to Washington, D.C., and I think that was actually very important to show that in light of the incapacity of DIRCO and other state entities, that civil society is actually taking international relations under its own sphere of influence. And I think that that's very important. I mean, I would be encouraging the Western Cape provincial government to be engaging in foreign affairs, and the DA similarly as well. But they came back, that Africana delegation. So there was Theo de Jager from SAI, Gerard Pappenfuss from NIASA, and
Solidarity Freedom Front,
and Mulder as well. And they said that the Americans have given 4 conditions for resetting the relationship. That's pushing back against kill the Boer, protecting private property rights and doing away with expropriation without compensation. There's the race laws, the 140 race laws. Our colleague Martin van Staden has been really instrumental in that, in kind of cataloguing the extent of racial law in South Africa. And the other one, what was the 4th condition? Private property, race laws, kill the Boer, and the farm murders.
Farm murders, yes.
Maybe people can correct us in the comments if we missed anything, but the general thrust is that the Americans aren't that happy with us, and a lot of their recommendations, these would actually be very beneficial for South Africa.
Look, I think I've spoken out against every one of those. I think the risk of doing that is that it provokes a sort of nativist backlash that, well, this is our country, we'll do what we want. But I think that on their own merits, those are actually fairly easy things, or at least 3 of them are. The BEE stuff, I'm just going to park for a moment. But why in a constitutional democracy does the president feel reluctant to say, no, actually, you shouldn't say kill anyone? Forget the history and anything. And I'm not talking about banning. I'm simply saying, no, this is not what we should do.
Yeah, the president condemns things all the time.
Yes, and that would be, but that's something that he's been conspicuously reluctant to do. Although I see there's something came out of the ANC's NEC that said that don't sing it anymore. But point is, yes, those are things that South Africa should actually do for its own good. BE, I think, is something more complicated because there's a huge patronage network that's been built around that. I define the budget as being geared towards 3 interest groups. First of all, the poor who receive social grants and things like that. Secondly, the civil service itself, who receive a middle-class lifestyle. And third, your tenderpreneur class. I said, now, I would say social grants, civil service, tenderpreneurs, that's 1, 2, 3, your 1, 2, 3 priorities. And if you have to kill one, kill the tenderpreneur class. Unfortunately, I think in terms of party influence, it goes the other way around. First of all, you have your tenderpreneurs and those who benefit from inflated contracts and from being cut into deals. Secondly, your civil service, and thirdly, quite a distant third, I would say, are people who actually receive life, the social grants and the free services. I think that there's going to be enormous pushback there, but you could at least, initiate some sort of interim measure and say, well, let's actually try and understand what this has really done. I think the evidence is fairly clear, although I'm happy to accept correction. But the idea seems to be, well, we're going to do what we want. I think, sadly, if you think you're thumbing your nose at Trump, well, maybe you are, and I hope that makes it easier for you to sleep at night. The damage, though, is to the country, and it actually, in these issues, has nothing to do with Trump. And you're absolutely right. I think that South Africans who do have some sort of reach there, whether it's the DA, whether it's the Freedom Front Plus, I would say that if the government had a shred of pragmatism, it should actually try and leverage that. And I think one of the things we've learned is that, unfortunately, the South African state just doesn't have that sort of reach. And, that should be of concern to us all.
Well, Terence Corrigan, thank you very much for visiting us here at the Free Market Foundation's offices at Northwoods House. And, we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us.
And it's always a pleasure to do so.
Thanks for watching this conversation with Terence Corrigan of the IRR. If you enjoyed this commentary, please do hit the like button and remember to subscribe to our channel, and also let us know what you think about the diplomatic relationship between South Africa and the United States down in the comments section. My name's David Ansara. Remember, stay free.